Reading with your kids.
Hey, so great to see you. Come on in. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, an iHeartRadio Best Kids and Family Podcast Award nominee. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, Good Pod, Podbean, Podcast Addict, Ghana, Himalaya, wherever you find your podcast. And please tell all your family and friends about the show. Our guest today is Danica Davidson. She is here to celebrate I Will Protect You, a true story of twins who survived Auschwitz. Before we invite Danica into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Lucas in the Game of Chance, written by Anthony Almena and illustrated by Donald Babbage. A reimagined Greek folk tale, Lucas in the Game of Chance is a story of a flute-playing boy who befriends a magical, talking, dancing snake. The snake bestows fortune and favor upon Lucas. Some years later, tempted by pride, Lucas loses all of his riches and his family. He now embarks on a treacherous journey to find destiny, sun and moon. They'll surely allow him to reverse his misfortune, won't they? This is a really exciting middle grade novel that will get your teens and tweens to shut off their devices and dive into reading. Lucas and the Game of Chance by Anthony Almena. This episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is also brought to you by I Will Love You Always and Until We Meet Again, two beautiful picture books written by Melissa Lyons. When faced with the loss of a loved one, sometimes it's hard to find the right words. Regardless of our age, we can feel grief deep within all of us. That's when it's time to turn to the beautiful, comforting, and deeply insightful books I Will Love You Always and Until We Meet Again. Loving guidance and consoling messages from our loved ones who have passed. Help to ease our pain and give us reason to reach for hope and love. Get your copies today. I Will Love You Always and Until We Meet Again. Two beautiful, beautiful picture books by Melissa Lyons. Join us right now from the great state of Michigan. Our guest is here today to celebrate a really important book. Our guest is Danica Davidson. She's here to celebrate I Will Protect You, a true story of twins who survived Auschwitz. Hey, Danica, how are you?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy that you're on. I'll be honest with you. I'm a little hesitant to jump into this conversation because it is such an important conversation, but it's also talking about such a horrific time in our history.
Right. And I grew up knowing about the Holocaust since I was little because it affected my family. And I assumed all kids knew all about the Holocaust. It started mainly with my dad teaching me about it because he wanted me to know. And as I've gotten older, I realized a lot of people don't know much about the Holocaust. And I think that's a real problem.
Right.
Because we see anti-Semitism, which is prejudice against Jews, growing in America and abroad. So I have actually experienced more anti-Semitism in the past few years than I had all the years before then. This is what eventually led me to seeing different Jewish speakers, because I wanted to learn more to be able to write about it. And one of those speakers was Eva Mozes Kor, who survived Auschwitz as an elementary school student, which, if you know anything about Auschwitz, is nearly impossible. It's a death camp. People are meant to die there. The reason she survived, or had a chance to survive, was because she was a twin. And there was a Nazi doctor there doing experiments on twins. So when I met her, I introduced myself to her afterward, hoping I could interview her for a magazine. And I mentioned I'd published 16 kids' books. I was just hoping to let her know that, yes, I'm a professional. I'll do a good job on this interview. She completely lit up at the kids' books and exclaimed she wanted to do a kids' book because she said the only way to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice is to talk to kids about it in an accessible way. And she said Holocaust education in America, if it happens at all in schools, usually happens at 12 or later. And she said it's too late because the prejudices are already formed then. And what makes this book work is the fact that she was a kid when she survived. That's how we can write it, because it's from a kid's perspective.
You know, I find it hard to believe that there are people who aren't aware of the Holocaust. I grew up in the city here in Boston, but adjacent to a very large Jewish neighborhood. So I've been aware of the Holocaust my entire life. It amazes me that some people aren't aware of it. It just blows my mind that some people deny that it happened. For the people, it's a chance that maybe there's somebody who's listening who isn't aware of the Holocaust and all the horrors that came with it. Tell us just a little bit about what it was, so we have a kind of a starting point. Everybody's on the same starting point.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you bring that up. I was doing some talks with classrooms earlier this year, virtual, of course, and I Will Protect You wasn't out yet. So I was talking about some of my other books, and I've written Minecraft or adventure books. So that's what the talk was about. That's a lot more fun than talking about Auschwitz. So I was mainly talking about that, and you see the kids light up every time I mention something with Minecraft or manga or anime. And then each time I would mention kind of briefly at the end, oh yes, I have a Holocaust book coming out. And there was absolutely no recognition on a single face. They did not seem to know what that word meant. That's
crazy. It's beyond crazy. It's wrong.
So the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews by Nazis and their helpers. It started with Jews having their rights stripped. Mm-hmm. These things don't come out of nowhere. And it continued to grow until finally there was something they called the final solution, where the Nazis wanted to kill all the Jews. Sometimes they were just shooting them. Sometimes they were sending them to camps, like what happened to Eva. Mm-hmm. And after the war, only 1 out of 3 Jews in the lands the Nazis had occupied were still alive. So, I mean, the culture's just gone. Yiddish was a big language spoken then. Yiddish is basically a dead language now. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was devastating to the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. My direct lines got out in time, but my cousins who were still in Europe were mostly all murdered.
Horrific. Just simply horrific. You sharing with us that your dad taught you about the Holocaust as you were growing up. Do you remember your initial thoughts as you were hearing these stories about your family?
He didn't bring up the fact that it was my family right away. It was more, well, when I was in preschool, I understood there's a very cruel man named Hitler, but I didn't really know details. When I got into elementary school, my dad would discuss it in just kind of a simplified language, matter of fact, which is how the book is done. Mm-hmm. It's not gruesome, but it's not going to sugarcoat facts. It's going to tell you what happened. And I remember being quite young, I would think like kindergarten, and he said that Jews were taken away in trains to camps, and what they did there was so awful, he wasn't going to tell me yet. And I'm like, well, it couldn't have been that awful, because I was in kindergarten. And then he told me later on, and I just remember feeling really sickened. Mm-hmm. But it also got me to think more, because I realized in the scope of how long people have been around, I'm not that far separated from the Holocaust. If I had lived just some years earlier, a few decades earlier, and lived in Europe, I might be in hiding. I might be dead. Mm-hmm. And that made that very real. And it kind of put an emphasis in me at an early age to be a critical thinker, mm-hmm. I would say, to question things. If things don't seem right, to ask about it, and to have more nuance and to have more empathy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think teaching kids about the Holocaust in an accessible way can do these things.
I really hope so. So please, Danica, tell us a little bit about the story.
It opens with Eva and her sister at school being bullied for being Jewish. And, Eva just told me her story. It's like hearing anyone else tell the life story. It wasn't told in order. She'd jump around. But I latched on to this because she kept bringing it up, and I thought that'd be a good place to open a kid's book about the Holocaust, because it's in a school, which is really familiar, and everyone mm-hmm. gets bullied at some point. Mm-hmm. But there's the angle of they're being bullied because they're Jewish. And from there, you see their rights get stripped away. And then they eventually get into Auschwitz. But the book also ends after the war and after Eva finds healing from her trauma. Because she did, and it took decades. Most kids' books are just going to be in the childhood. This goes a little bit into her adulthood just because with a kid's book this age, you have to end with some hope. You know, young adult or adult books might end with just the tragedy. But with kids' books, they're going to want to know, how can I make a difference? How can we stop this from happening again? So then Eva also gave some suggestions that I put in there. One of her suggestions was respect. She said that she preferred respect over tolerance because tolerance means basically you put up with someone. She said respect, I mean, basically you see the humanity in the other person. You don't have to agree with them on everything. But she said, you hear them out and they hear you out. That's respect.
Very, very important. I'm at a point in my life where I just don't get the hatred. You know, there's so many wonderful things in our lives that to just go and hate somebody for their religion or their race or their ethnicity or their lifestyle, it's beyond me. I guess I'm getting this way because I'm almost 100 years old and I'm looking at life in a different way now. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around hate.
Yeah, it seems like throughout history, people just have to find scapegoats to avoid their own responsibility. And life is complicated, and it's a lot easier just to blame another group. Once a group's been blamed once, it's easier to blame them again. And we see Jewish people blamed throughout history and even now. I mean, there are conspiracy theories about us related to COVID. It just continues. And I'm hoping this book, besides teaching kids about the Holocaust, will help them recognize anti-Semitism here and now. I also hope it helps kids recognize extremism in any form it takes, because anything can be taken to the extreme. I hope they better recognize propaganda. Not everything is what it looks like on the surface. You know, dig deeper, don't jump on every bandwagon. And I hope they can better recognize conspiracy theories. Especially with the internet and social media, they're spreading a lot more. There's also something interesting in there because, you know, Eva had to deal with the Nazis. After the war, she was living in Romania. And then she had to deal with the communists in Romania. And she actually joined the communists for a while because they were talking about equality and brotherhood and all this. And that sounded great after being with the Nazis. But then she discovered it was propaganda. They were not doing equality. It was about power. And she told me about that. And when I wrote it in the book, I put in stuff to kind of connect it of this is why you don't just believe what people say at face value. You see what their actions are. They might be saying great things, but doing something completely different.
I think that's really important. We've talked a lot here on the podcast about parents and our role as parents to help our kids to learn how to discern what information they can trust and what information they can't, especially nowadays because there are so many sources of information, so many sources of bad information, unreliable information. But sometimes it seems that those unreliable sources are the loudest and they're the most prevalent. And they're packaged in a way that is really attractive and really easy to grab onto. So I think that your book it's really important for it could be a really important and helpful tool for parents in that effort to help kids learn that skill.
Yeah, I'd love that. And my background is in journalism, and I've noticed, especially online, things are getting a lot less objective. A lot of different news outlets are going to tell you, depending on what you believe, exactly what you want to hear. And that's where people gravitate. They want to be told they're right.
It is bizarre. There have been many occasions, and I try to switch around that I'll be watching one news station 1 minute, and they're talking about a story, and then I switch over to the other news station, and they're talking about the same story, but you wouldn't believe it by the words that are being said. It sounds like two completely different stories.
Right. At this point, whenever I'm looking up news on something, I always read more than one source.
Mm-hmm.
And I always go as close to the primary source or use the primary source. And that is a lot of stuff that's going on is they take things out of context and they slant it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're missing context, it's very easy to take meanings there that aren't actually there. And we do see examples of that in this book and how people do that.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned is that Eva learned how to heal from her trauma. Can you share a little bit about how she healed?
She healed decades later because, as you can imagine, she was extremely angry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who wouldn't be? But she found for decades the anger was eating her up and it wasn't hurting the Nazis. She actually was part of a manhunt to try to track Mengele down. That's the doctor who experimented on her. He escaped to South America after the war. He lived and died a free man. And after he died, she found that she still had the anger, wasn't doing anything. And she decided she was no longer going to hate him because the hatred made her his prisoner because it kept him on her mind. And she chose to call it forgiveness. Some people took issue with this because they think she's talking about like pardoning them. And I want to make it very clear, no, she is not talking about pardoning Nazis.
Right.
She is talking about not letting the hatred get her down. And it reminds me more of Stoic philosophy, where you can't control your outside world, you can control your thoughts. And she said, this man has controlled my thoughts because I've been so angry at him. And he's still my master. And when he's no longer controlling me in my thoughts, I feel free.
Right. I think that's a great lesson for us, again, to share with our kids. I know I Will Protect You is a book that I would absolutely want to sit down and to have read with my son and my daughter when they were that 8 to 12-year-old range. I know it would spark phenomenal conversations.
I think this is a great book for parents and teachers to read with kids because kids are going to have a lot of questions, I'm sure, especially if this is their introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was Eva like to know and to sit and to talk with?
Eva was, I don't know, she's like 4'8" or something, and I'm 5'5", and I just towered over her, which I'm not used to, towering over other adults. And maybe she was 4'10", but I'm saying she was so tiny and she was so huge because she just kind of filled the room. She had that sort of spirit to her. Mm-hmm. She was incredibly active. She was always doing stuff for Holocaust education and reaching out to different people. And one thing that I thought was interesting is she had friends in all stripes of life. Like people who might not get along were still friends with Eva because Eva was just very welcoming and very accessible. Yeah. And she was so dedicated to Holocaust education. I was telling you before we officially started recording, we finished this book. We sent it out to publishers. We got an offer from Little Brown. It's June 19th. And Eva passed away July 4th at Auschwitz on an education trip.
Wow.
We had accepted Little Brown's offer. She was very excited to know the book was coming out. But she's not here to see it today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What did you feel when you learned that not only that this person that you had grown close to, and I imagine may have become friends with, passed away, but not only passed away, but passed away in the place where she had escaped death decades before?
I learned the day after the 4th of July. I was actually out doing volunteer work at a used bookstore where the money goes to help animals in the area, like dogs and cats. I was putting away books from Little Brown on the shelf and smiling, going, oh, we're going to be published by Little Brown. And that's when I got the phone call. It was like a punch in the gut. Because we had grown close. I was not expecting it. She'd had some health issues that year. She'd been to the doctor. But she was assuring me, she was fine. She was safe to travel. As soon as she got back, we're going to start promoting the book. And nothing has been the same since.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm sure. But her life lives on in the pages of your book, and her story lives on. And hopefully that story is going to inspire a new generation to love and to care for one another.
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you've written other children's books. Can you tell us a little bit about those books and about your career?
Yes, I started writing since I was like 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Very young, I would dictate stories to my parents mainly. I was writing lots of chapter books in middle school, sending out to agents and getting nowhere. I found it was easier to get into journalism, so I started working as a professional journalist in high school. And I built my way up from there, and now I have 18 books out.
Wow.
Middle grade and young adult. So they're all quite different. I really enjoy writing in different styles. Mm-hmm. So I have 12 Minecraft or adventure books. Mm-hmm. These are about Stevie, who's an 11-year-old boy who actually lives in Minecraft, the game, and he finds a portal to Earth and accidentally lets Minecraft out with him. So these I hear from a lot of parents and kids who like to read these together. A lot of kids who are into Minecraft love to read these books. And they mix kind of real kid issues in there because there's stuff about cyberbullying, but ultimately they're adventure stories. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then I've written some manga how to draw books. If you're not familiar, manga are Japanese comics. Mm-hmm. Anime are Japanese animation. And I have manga art for beginners, which is a bestseller, which will teach you how to draw in the manga style. Mm. And a lot of these manga or any kind of art books, when they teach you how to draw, it's like 3 squiggly things and you're done. And I can't follow that. So these are much more detailed. Then we have the sequel to that called Manga Art for Everyone's coming out next month, July 21st, I think it is, or 17th. I think it's the 17th. But I just had another book, Chalk Art Manga, come out June 21st. That's where I mixed up the date. Mm. So this is the first ever book on how to draw manga-style characters with chalk.
Ooh, neat.
Really step by step.
Awesome.
And it goes from, more simple characters to more complex ones. Mm-hmm. And with these, I worked with Reina Seiya, who's a professional Japanese manga creator.
That's neat.
Thank you. So as you can see, I'm kind of all over the place.
Yeah. So having this experience of writing the how to draw manga books and writing the Minecraft books, we've had some authors of other Minecraft novels on. Were you hesitant to take on this project with Eva?
No, because, I had moments where I kind of doubted myself of, can I do this? I was intimidated, but I also have moments of, no, if no one else is going to do it, I might as well. Because I was seeing a lot of gaps in Holocaust education for kids and for people in general. And so a lot of those things I saw as gaps, I put into this book. Mm-hmm. For example, a lot of people don't know 6 million Jews who were murdered. They think it's a smaller number. Mm-hmm. I made sure to put that number in there. Yeah. I made sure to go into the history of anti-Semitism because you don't have the Holocaust out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people seem to think that Jews suffered in the 40s, but never before or after. I'm here to tell you, no, that's not true.
Right, yes. Jews have suffered throughout history.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you... And I haven't... Because I just dismiss it when I hear it. But I hear there are people who deny that the Holocaust happened. And like I said, I don't bother listening to their reasoning behind it. But how can somebody say that, no, this didn't happen when we have records? The one thing the Germans or the Nazis were very good at were keeping records. And we have all this historical evidence, physical evidence, and that exists, and yet some people who aren't crazy, or at least seemingly aren't crazy, who seem to be responsible, holding responsible jobs, leading different groups, are able to say, no, this didn't happen.
I think that goes into the thing of people, if they don't like it, they can just think they can pretend it never happened. It's not convenient to their worldview. And we see a lot of that, not just with the Holocaust denial and all sorts of things. I haven't run into too much outright Holocaust denial in my life, but obviously it exists. What I run into a lot more is what we might call Holocaust trivialization, mm-hmm. where people say, like, oh, I don't like this thing. It's just like the Holocaust. or, oh, the Holocaust wasn't that bad. It was just for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
That I run into quite often. And that's part of what led to writing this book.
It just lasted for a few years.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And yet 6 million Jews, that's, I think there are less than 1 million people living within the city of Boston. Or even if there are 1 million people living in the city of Boston, just multiply that by 6.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other groups that are also targeted and killed. People who were LGBTQ were murdered. The Romani people were murdered. It's a horrible thing, and we can't let it happen again.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing concerning things right now,
Mm-hmm.
here and abroad, especially abroad, like with Ukraine, with concentration camps in China.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff just keeps repeating in echoes and parallels. It's not exactly the same. It's never going to be exactly the same. But we see way too many similarities.
Yeah. Well, I know people are going to want to know where they can go to find out more about I Will Protect You, a true story of twins who survived Auschwitz, and also more about you and your other books.
And I'd love for people to check it out. I Will Protect You is available in bookstores. It's available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, any of those places. You can also go to my website, which is danicadavidson.com. So that's DANICADAVIDSON.com. And I have all my books there and links where you can get them and more information about them.
Yeah. We've had a really important conversation with the author of I Will Protect You, a true story of twins who survived Auschwitz. And we've been speaking with the author, Danica Davidson. Danica, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me, giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Abigail Gimple. She'll be here to celebrate Hyper Healing. It's a parenting book, especially for parents dealing with kids who have learning difficulties, maybe on the autism spectrum. That's the next episode of the podcast. If you are the author of a fantastic children's book, a middle grade novel, YA title, or parenting book, we would love to help you tell the world all about it. So many ways that we can help you celebrate your book here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. You can be a guest. You can take part in our Certified Great Read program. And you can also become part of our monthly promotion program, and we'll celebrate your books with commercials on the podcast, messages to our 99,000 plus social media followers, and display your book in our nationwide network of digital pedestrian billboards. All you need to do is go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, click on the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page, and scroll on down to our various services. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Danica Davidson. Please be sure to check out I Will Protect You, a true story of twins who survived Auschwitz. Also want to thank our sponsors. I Will Love You Always and Until We Meet Again, two beautiful, beautiful books written by Melissa Lyons. And also want to thank Lucas and the Game of Chance by Anthony L. Manna. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Nicole Belcastro, Ashley Contreras, Mirabella Q, Rain Pan. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.